Hello everyone, and today we have a very special video for you guys. Today we are going to be covering the Egyptian Pharaohs line of succession. We're going to be going all the way from the start of the first dynasty with Narmer, all the way down to the Ptolemy period and the fall of Egypt with Cleopatra, the very last Egyptian pharaoh. Now, this line of succession is not going to be the same as some of the other ones that I've done, simply because we have to cover over 3,000 years of history. Yes, you heard me. 3,000 years of history in this video. So I can't just type out every single individual year and show you who's pharaoh that year. Instead, I just got a list of them all, dynasty by dynasty. Now, this is the first time on this channel that I have ever this is the first time in this channel's history that I have ever done any ancient history before. I have never tackled ancient history on this channel before. This is the very first time. So keep in mind that ancient history, the way that it's studied is a little bit different than what I usually do here. We'll get into that when we get into that. But we'll be starting with 3100 BCE. I wrote out BCE here. If you notice, I'm right over here now. I'm on the screen because of the way that this slideshow's set up. Let's get out our trusty laser pointer here. So, BCE means before Common Era. I didn't just put BC because BC supposedly means before Christ, which is kind of a religious term. And it seems like nowadays people have just gone toward using BCE much more, especially Egyptologists have gone to using BCE, so before Common Era. So that's where we're starting. So without further ado, let's freaking get into this. Alright, so we're starting off here with Dynasty I. Now, there are, for those of you that don't know, 31 different dynasties spreading through the entire history of ancient Egypt. Now, we don't really know where Egypt started or how Egypt started, just because it was so long ago, nearly 5,000 years ago. There's not much written history back then. Ancient Egypt is one of the oldest human civilizations that we know about. There's barely any older. The only ones older than I can think of are maybe the Indus River Valley, China, and maybe, well, I know Mesopotamia, but Egypt is up there too. So we don't really know how it started, and we do know that there are a handful of pharaohs that we know about that existed before Dynasty I, before the first dynasty, and they're kind of known as the Zero Dynasty. But this is going all the way back to the Archaic period, which is also known as the Stone Ages. So this is literally going extremely far back to the Archaic period. Now, this is a period of time that is just almost unknown to people. So we're going to get started with Dynasty I here. There are a couple pharaohs from the Zero Dynasty, but we're not going to be going over those today just because they're so rugged. We don't really know much about them at all. So that's that. So let's get started with Dynasty I here. So the first pharaoh, who is generally considered to be the first pharaoh of Egypt, is Narmer, a man named Narmer. So he was the first pharaoh in Dynasty I. Now, it's kind of disputed. No one really knows when Narmer lived. It could have been, some people think 33, usually somewhere between 3,300 or 3,200 and 2,800 BCE is typically when they Egyptologists they're kind of debating on when Narmer lived. We don't know exactly when he lived. We just know he did live. And there's an old record found that was found about 100 years ago or so that has a list of all of the pharaohs in Dynasty I. So keep in mind too that there's so much about ancient Egypt that is just unknown to us at this time, and most of the archaeological studies have taken place in the last century. I mean, really the first time that people got out to Egypt to do, archaeological digs and stuff was in like the 1920s. So really, we only know about like the last 100 years of what we've discovered. So chances are that 100, 150 years, 200 years down the line, our view on ancient Egypt might be completely different what is today. Just take these dates with a grain of salt, everybody, before we get started into this video. And the names of the pharaohs are pretty much concrete. It's just the dates can be a little bit sketchy. And not all pharaohs will be on this list. It's only the ones that actually had significance. So there were plenty of pharaohs that did not make this list just because they're there. I just want to let you know that not every single pharaoh is in this video, but almost all of them are. So that's just how that is. So Narmer is generally considered to be the very first pharaoh in Dynasty I. He is usually the first pharaoh. Most Egyptologists can agree that Narmer started the entire ancient Egyptian empire. Now, before Narmer, Egypt was split into two kingdoms. It was known as the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Actually, Lower Egypt was to the north, Upper Egypt was to the south. And it had to do with how the Nile River flowed, because the Nile River flows north to south. So Lower Egypt was actually the northern part, and Upper Egypt was the lower part. Or the Upper Egypt was the lower part. Lower Egypt was the upper part. It was just very confusing. It had to do with how the Nile River flowed. Anyway, Narmer, I believe, was ruler of, I think, Upper Egypt. And he was the guy, Narmer was the guy to unite both parts of Egypt into one kingdom and create the pharaoh. Now, the pharaohs, they weren't really called pharaohs until the 18th dynasty during the New Kingdom. But this is way back there. Typically, he would have just probably been considered a king, but we know them today as pharaohs, so he's going to be pharaoh. So some of them are pharaohs and kings. There's really not much of a difference. They're pretty much the same thing, but pharaohs, that was a title that was made way later on. So Narmer was the very first pharaoh of the first dynasty. So he dies in 3055 BCE, leaving the throne to Or-Aha. Now, we don't know exactly how the succession works because I don't have line successions, because sometimes it's father-son, sometimes it's basic, but sometimes it can be a war that goes on. We just really don't know how, especially these early dynasties, how they're related to each other. It's honestly a miracle that we even have pictures of them. This is just stuff that we've found over the years, and a lot of the times during the Roman Empire, a lot of the tombs were robbed and stuff like that, so a lot of the stuff is gone now. We just have the little bits and pieces that were left behind after thousands and thousands of years. So, 3055 to 3022 BCE, we have Or-Aha. He was the second pharaoh of United Egypt of the first dynasty, Or-Aha, or Hor-Aha, however you want to say that. Not much is known about him. Not much is known about these earlier pharaohs. We just know they existed, and we know the order of the first dynasty. So that is Hor-Aha. He was the second pharaoh in the first dynasty. He ruled from 3055 to 3022 BCE. Again, these dates are a little bit sketchy. But that would have been impressive if he ruled that whole time, especially for back in the 3000s BC, if he actually ended up ruling for 33 years, which he very well could have. Next up is Jer. Jer is one of the more influential first dynasty pharaohs. Again, I don't know what's going on in this picture right here, but that's just what it is. So he supposedly ruled from 3022 to 2990 BCE. Again, that would be a total of a 38-year reign, which would be pretty impressive, but again, we don't know for sure. So Jer was followed by Jet. So we get Jer and Jet. I believe they were brothers, but I could be wrong on that. They were somehow related to each other. Jer and Jet. No, you know what it was? Jer was the father of Jet, but Jet's parents were actually brother and sister, and that was a very common practice for ancient Egypt back then. So that was kind of how it was. And back during the first dynasty, I forgot to mention as well, human sacrificing was a very common practice by ancient Egyptians. So usually whenever the pharaoh died, they didn't even have pyramids back in the first dynasty. So what they would do is they would bury like the pharaoh under an underground crypt. somewhere in like a really long shaped building, and they would have people lined up, tens of hundreds of people to be sacrificed every time the pharaoh died, because they believed that the Egyptian gods, they had a belief that the pharaohs would be lonely in the afterlife, so they had to get all of his subjects, and they would execute all of the pharaoh's subjects with him. They would sacrifice, I shouldn't say execute, they sacrificed all of the pharaoh's subjects along with the pharaoh. After the pharaoh died, they would sacrifice all the subjects so they could be with him in the afterlife. But the pharaohs were buried in like underground crypts, and I guess this is a picture of Jet. But this is how we know them. We don't even have statues of them. There's hieroglyphs, pictures of them that somehow Egyptologists have been able to translate over the years, and to try to translate what it's saying in Jet, and that is a pharaoh. But they found it, like I said, they found an old list of all of them. But Jet was from 2990 to 2975, and what we know of is Jet's parents were actually brother and sister. Very common practice, and that goes all the way down even to the New Kingdom. So this is still the Archaic period. Again, no pyramids, nothing. It was just, there's probably barely any buildings left from the first dynasty. I mean, this is such a long time ago, guys. So next up is Den. Den was the next pharaoh. Den actually was one of the more important, he did some very important stuff for Egypt, especially in the earlier years. He was a great warrior, as you can see by the picture here. He's fighting off some birds and whatnot, he conquered a good amount of land for back then. Nothing compared to some of the conquests during the golden age of Egypt. But Den, early on, was probably one of the greatest, and most influential pharaoh of the first dynasty, if you don't count Narmer, of course, uniting both parts of Egypt into one. Egypt had a lot of land. It was one of the biggest empires of the time. 2975 to 2950 BCE we're looking at for dates for Den's reign. After Den was Enedjib. Again, please excuse me if I butcher some of these names, because they're not regular names. Enedjib was next. Now, again, there's not really a picture of him. All we got is a hieroglyph. So this is the kind of stuff that we're looking at here. This is how they discover who they are. This is a hieroglyph of Enedjib. So that's all we know of him. We don't know anything about Enedjib whatsoever. We just know he existed. And sometimes the dates being put around 2950 to 2936 BCE for his reign. Again, 14-year reign. That's not too shabby for back then. Especially later on, you'll see there'll be a lot of pharaohs that don't reign long at all. Then you got some that reign a long time. Actually, one of the longest reigning monarchs in history was an Egyptian pharaoh. So after Enedjib, we get Semerkhet. Semerkhet we actually have kind of a picture of. It's kind of like a hieroglyph style, but you can actually see the person. So he ruled from 2936 to 2913 BCE. Again, not much is known about Semerkhet either. But I think he's a pretty good... He was probably a pretty good guy. I don't know. Who knows, guys? Who knows? Next up is Kwa'a. I'm not sure about how they pronounce Q's in Egyptian, but that's how they did it. Kwa'a. So this is kind of a picture of a hieroglyphic. I don't know if this is his tomb or not. Like I said, they buried him in crypts. During the first dynasty, they didn't have pyramids. That didn't come along till the Old Kingdom. This was before the Old Kingdom. This was hundreds of years before the Old Kingdom. There were three golden ages in Egyptian history: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And this is before the Old Kingdom. There were intermediate periods in between each of the golden ages, so to speak. So for Ka, we're looking at 2913 to 2890 BCE. So now that is it for Dynasty I. There's the 7 pharaohs in Dynasty I. So there were 7 in total. Usually each dynasty ranging usually between 5 and 20 pharaohs. 20 is pretty rare. It's usually 5 and 15, around 10 per dynasty. It obviously depends. Now, next up is Dynasty II, the last dynasty of the Archaic period during the Stone Ages. Because after this, we get the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age starts in human history, which is where kind of we get to know a little bit more. So Dynasty II, we actually know less about Dynasty II than Dynasty I, but still takes place during the Archaic period. The first pharaoh from Dynasty II was Hotep II. Now, Hotep II, when he comes to the throne of Egypt, Egypt was kind of falling apart, so to speak, kind of going back to how it had been 200 years prior with the split. Most of the time, most of the history of Dynasty II, the second dynasty in Egypt, it was split for most of it. A lot of these pharaohs weren't ruling over the entirety of the empire. They were split into several areas, but mainly there were two pharaohs at once. But it was a really common practice during Dynasty II that the pharaoh would reign with their son. That way, when they die, the son already knows what they're doing, which is actually a really common practice. And I'm surprised that European monarchs later on, and Asian monarchs didn't even take advantage of that. They just wanted all the power to themselves. But that was a very good way of stabilizing it. But again, Dynasty II kind of fell apart. Although Hotep II, and that was kind of a reason that Dynasty I fell apart, was because then Dynasty II starts. So Hotep II, 2890 to 2864, not a bad reign for him. It doesn't really start to fall apart until we get to these later ones in Dynasty II. So these were all probably full Egypt here. So this is Nebra, also known as Raneb, ruled from 2864 to 2834 BCE. That is really cool. I mean, I'm really fascinated by the history of even the clothing that these guys are wearing. I mean, it's crazy. I'm gonna go back to Second Dynasty. This is insane that we even have this stuff. I mean, think about that if you're going to see that thing in a museum or something. That's crazy just to see that. But yeah, Nebra Raneb was next in the Second Dynasty there, and then we get Ninetcher was the next pharaoh, 2834 to 2784 BCE. Very impressive if that was a 50-year reign for Ninetcher. Next up, we have kind of a disputed one. Wagenes, also known as Senedj. There was a joint reign between these two monarchs here. But most of the monarchs from this point forward had joint reigns because the kingdom was split during the Second Dynasty. So Wagenes and Senedj is a joint reign. What Egyptologists have discovered is what the hieroglyphs signify joint reigns between father and sons of the pharaoh, which was interesting. So he's looking at 2784 to 2776 BCE. And then we get Senedj. So you see Wagenes dies in 2776 BCE, leaving the throne to his son Senedj, and then his son Sekhemib is joint reigning with him, and then by the time Senedj dies in 2760, Sekhemib can take the throne. So then we get Sekhemib with a joint reign with Seth Peribsen, and this is the I don't know what that was. Sekhemib, Seth Peribsen, as a joint reign. This is the stone that signifies it. So, dies in 2730, Sekhemib. So, Seth Peribsen actually ends up only reigning by himself from 2730 to 2714 BCE. So, these are kind of pretty interesting here. These are the styles of King Peribsen. So these are the stones with the hieroglyphs on them, pictures of them. So that is very interesting there. And then there is Nefer-Khosokar. This is again during the split period, 2714 to 2707 BCE. There's no picture of him. I could not find a picture of this guy online or a picture of the hieroglyphs. So typically in this video, you'll see later on, if I can't find a picture, I'll put the hieroglyphs, usually the throne name or the birth name on the hieroglyphics down on the name down here. But for this, there's just nothing. because there's literally nothing for him. Same with Hujeffa the First, nothing. This is 2711 to 2709 BCE, so for Hujeffa the First. And then that brings us to the last pharaoh of Dynasty II, which is Khasa Khemui. Khasa Khemui is probably the best known of Dynasty II. It is believed that he is the father of the first pharaoh of Dynasty III, Djoser, but it's not 100% confirmed if that's the case or not. But most Egyptologists believe that. So, Khasa Khemui ruled sometime between 2707 to 2668 BCE, but it's strongly believed that he ruled between 2707 to 2686 BCE, but he also could have ruled in 2668, sometime between that period. We don't really know for sure. So this is going to take us, that's the end of Dynasty II and the end of the Stone Age, the Archaic period. So now we're going to move on to Dynasty III, which is the start of the Old Kingdom. Alright guys, I just got back from marching band a couple hours ago. Sorry if I look like a sweaty mess. This is the same shirt, but it's a different day filming this. But I wore the same shirt, so that's just how that is. Now we are going to be getting into kind of the so-called Golden Age of Egypt. Now this is when Egypt kind of starts to become Egypt as we know it and think about it today. Obviously those first two dynasties that we just went over in the Archaic period was not the usual ancient Egypt, although that's just the really, really old stuff. So now we're going to get into what is known as the Old Kingdom. Now, there were three so-called golden ages that Egyptologists refer to during Egyptian time periods. The first one was the Old Kingdom, and then the Middle Kingdom, and then the New Kingdom, which happened about 500 years after one another. And there are periods in the middle called intermediate periods, which we'll get to that here in a second. But the first pharaoh of Dynasty III was Djoser. Now, Djoser is probably top 5 Egyptian pharaohs of all time. I mean, he's the guy who kicked off the Old Kingdom, kicked off the Third Dynasty. He is believed to be the son of Khasa Khemui here. Let me get out my laser pointer again. Khasa Khemui, he's believed to be his son. Now, Djoser completely changed the ideology of Egypt. Djoser had great ambitions. He's one of the most legendary figures in Egyptian history. He laid out the assets for the entirety of the rest of the empire's history. He had great ambitions. First of all, he wanted to build sort of, instead of getting rid of those, crypt tombs with the long, flat buildings that the previous first two dynasty pharaohs had been buried under, he wanted grand tombs like pyramids. He was the guy who first decided to form pyramids, and it was under the construction of Imhotep, who kind of pioneered that. So Imhotep, along with Djoser, was kind of the guy to kind of construct these first pyramids that came in Egyptian history. The first ever pyramid ever built was Djoser's pyramid. When he died, it was the Stepstone Pyramid. It still stands today. It is one of the oldest buildings that still exist. It was built at the very beginning of the first of the Old Kingdom in the Third Dynasty. Now, Djoser reigned from 2668 to 2648 BCE. Now, he had great ambitions throughout his reign. He also pioneered the idea of sphinxes. When when the pharaoh dies, there's a sphinx version of them that's put. And he's the guy to pioneer that. He did not build the Pyramid of Giza. That was not until the Fourth Dynasty. The Fourth Dynasty really expanded on Djoser's ambitions. But during the Third Dynasty, it was Djoser along with Imhotep who were the two to really pioneer the pyramid idea, which greatly expanded the architecture of the era. And the Third Dynasty also kicked off what is now known as the Bronze Age today. The Bronze Age is a period of ancient history that, now there were a ton of different empires that existed in the world at this time. It wasn't just Egypt, but Egypt definitely benefited, and most historians would believe and agree with me that Egypt benefited from the Bronze Age more than any other dynasty, any other empire did at that time. Djoser was succeeded by Sekhmet Sekhemket. And he reigned only for 6 years, from 2648 to 2642 BCE. Now this is him right here. Again, that's just a hieroglyph of him. He was, I believe, Djoser's son. Again, still little was known about them, but he still did rule during the Bronze Age, one of the first golden age in Egyptian history, building pyramids and whatnot. Then there was Hujefa II, who we don't know. I don't really know what happened to Hujefa the first. I don't really know if that was a thing or not. Unknown on the dates there for him. Same thing with Mesotris. However, this is kind of a disputed one. 2642 to 2636 BCE. We have Nebkara or Neferkara. He's known by two. We don't know if this is the same one known by two names, or if it's two separate pharaohs that reigned together, or two separate pharaohs that reigned at the same time. I don't know. But after Djoser reunited Egypt, or it was probably Sekhemket who did that. It might have gotten divided a couple more times. Again, this period of Egypt is very murky. We do know more about the Old Kingdom than the Archaic period, obviously. We know a lot about the 3rd and 4th dynasties. Out of all the old dynasties, we know the most about them. Then there is Huni. Huni was one of the more memorable pharaohs. He, of the 3rd dynasty at least, he kind of expanded on Djoser's ambitions. The other the other pharaohs didn't do that as much. But once you get into this time, he starts to build more pyramids and stuff like that. He actually has a pretty long reign, over 23 years, 2636 to 2613 BCE for Huni. And then we get to Dynasty IV. Dynasty IV is the next one. He was the last monarch, or last pharaoh of Dynasty III. Dynasty IV, which continues the Old Kingdom. Now, Dynasty IV is when it starts to explode. The Great Pyramid of Giza and the Great Sphinx of Giza, which you can see right here, were both built during Dynasty IV. And I will show you the pharaoh who contributed to that. Just a second here. So the first pharaoh believed to be of Dynasty IV is Sneferu. Sneferu ruled from 2613 to 2589 BCE. Now this is a statue of him that we know. And this is when, once you start to get into the 4th, 5th, and 6th dynasties, this is when Djoser, the previous pharaoh, I'll go back here for you guys. Djoser, he starts to become kind of a legend, and he's known as kind of like the greatest pharaoh to ever live, and kind of like worshipped like a god almost. But this is when the Egyptian gods and the religions start to really try to come into play. But they almost worship Djoser as like a god, which is part of the reason the pyramids keep getting built. So Sneferu happens, but it's not until the second pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, Khufu, who builds. So he's on the throne for 23 years, just like one of his predecessors there in the 3rd dynasty, 2589 to 2566 BCE. Now, Khufu is the guy who built the Great Pyramid of Giza, probably one of the most famous buildings and one of the 7 man-made wonders of the ancient world is the Great Pyramid of Giza. This thing was so crazy that the Great Pyramid of Giza stood as the tallest man-made structure in history for the next 4,000 years. I don't think it was until the 1930s when they built the Empire State Building in New York City that this was passed. This thing was roughly around 500 feet tall for back in the 3rd millennium BCE. That is insane. BC, wow. It's incredible that they were able to put that together. Obviously, it took a lot of manpower to build that. It took them years, probably decades, probably 20 years. I think it took them 20 years to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. But you had the slaves, they would walk up piece by piece, put brick by brick on, and oftentimes they would break their legs, whether for dropping stuff on each other or falling off or tripping or whatnot. There found a lot of mummies of preserved, not slaves, but pharaohs and stuff, prominent nobles, mummies of them that have been broken bones. So they would break their bones, they just live with that the rest of their life. I mean, it was rare for an Egyptian, just an average old Egyptian, to make it over the age of 30 or 35. I mean, usually most people, was not uncommon for people to die in their 20s and maybe even their teens back in the Egyptian times. That's just how it was. So Khufu built the Great Pyramid of Giza. He also built the Great Sphinx of Giza. Two of the most revolutionary just architecture in history. I don't know if he built the Great Sphinx of Giza, but if you're wondering who the Great Sphinx of Giza is supposed to be, a lot of people think it's like Ramses or King Tut, but that was way later than that. They were the New Kingdom. This is the Old Kingdom. All that stuff was built during the Old Kingdom. It's all ancient stuff. So that's just how that is there. So the Great Sphinx of Giza is Khufu. So that is who that is. So upon Khufu's death, since he built the Great Pyramid, they built a huge sphinx for him. And that was what that came with. And that came with the contributions of Rajadef, who was the next pharaoh from Dynasty IV, 2566 to 2558 BC. And then there was Khafre. Oh, I was wrong. Khufu was that. Khafre is actually who the Sphinx is. The famous Sphinx that we all know today, that is Khafre. So upon Khafre's death, they built that Sphinx for him because he was seen as like one of the greater pharaohs, not as legendary as Djoser was. But Khufu, it kind of took him a little bit to really worship. They didn't really worship Khufu like they did with Djoser. Djoser was just seen as like the peak of the Egyptian pharaohs. I mean, no one back at this time really thought too highly of like Narmer or any of those pharaohs from the first two dynasties, but Djoser was very shined upon. I mean, people looked up to him and wanted to be just like him. All the pharaohs did. So Khafre, once he died, so he rules from 2558 to 2532 BCE. They built the Sphinx for him, so that's who Khafre is, and that was built around the 2500s BCE. So Menkaure was the pharaoh who kind of helped bring that to a thing. Obviously, Imhotep was dead by this point, but Menkaure was kind of the guy who put that in there. Now, this is actually like a metal container of him, and like I said, most of the remains of especially almost all of the pharaohs in the Old Kingdom, or just anything older than the New Kingdom, have at some point, especially when the Romans took it over, have been completely robbed by grave robbers. They during the Roman Empire, when the Romans took over Egypt, a lot of barbarians and such, or just Roman people, would come in, break into the pyramids, and take all of the gold that was buried with the pharaohs, and take all their bones and just get rid of them all, and just all destroyed. So it's really hard to find anything older than even the New Kingdom. I mean, most of the New Kingdom stuff has been destroyed, but all of the stuff from the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and all the intermediates in between, stuff going back this far, and almost all of these pharaohs that we've talked about, all of their bodies are just completely gone. We don't know anything really about. We don't really have any idea what happened to their bodies. But like I said with Djoser, we do know the pyramid that he was buried in. Although all of the items and belongings that he was buried with are gone because they were robbed, because obviously gold and stuff like that was very highly sought after. So that is Menkaure, 2532 to 2503, 29 years on the Egyptian throne there. So next up is Shepseskaf, 2503 to 2498, just a 5-year reign for him, BC. Then there was some more pharaohs from the 4th dynasty that we don't know much about, including Balfra, Tamptis, those two. Dates are unclear. We can't really piece them together. We're not 100% sure on the order of these pharaohs, too, but we're pretty certain on them. Again, these dates aren't exact, so don't just take it all with a grain of salt, because there's still so much to learn about Egypt, which is the fascinating thing about learning about Egyptian history and ancient history in general, is just the mystery of it all. We're not 100% sure on pretty much anything that we're talking about, but we are 100% sure on a couple of things, and the rest are a mystery, which makes it interesting. So now we're going to get to Dynasty V. Now this is the latter end of the Old Kingdom. This is where it kind of starts to, it probably hit its peak in the 4th dynasty. Dynasty 5 and 6 is kind of coming back down. The pyramid. Haha, see what I did there? Pyramid. Egyptian joke. Alright, so that's the Dynasty 4. The first monarch of Dynasty 5 is Userkaf. Userkaf was mainly noted to be kind of like a conquester. By the time you get to the 5th dynasty, Djoser's just seen as like a legend at this point. And they're still building pyramids, obviously, in the 5th dynasty, but nothing as grand as the 4th dynasty or the 3rd dynasty were. They're kind of just backing off of that now. Kind of now working on campaigns to try to conquer some more land. That's what really Userkaf's big plan is for his rule. And he does a good job of that. Unfortunately, he's only on the throne for like 7 years, 2490 to 2491, but he had great ambitions, and that's why the new dynasty started with them. Obviously, like I said, the dynasties, I don't really think they were really existed back during Egyptian times. I don't know really if they consider themselves to be part of different dynasties or not, but that's just kind of a thing that we've put on them just to separate the different periods of Egyptian history. So now we get 2491 to 2477 BC with Sahura. Sahura is the next pharaoh, kind of following along in Userkaf's footsteps there. And then we get Neferkare, 2477 to 2467 BCE. So 10 years on the throne, Neferkare. And this is when you kind of get the polytheism. Most of the modern day Egyptian gods, not modern day, what am I saying? Most of the Egyptian gods that we know today started to be worshipped around this time. They weren't always worshipped. I need to do a little bit more research on Egyptian religions, but I don't know much of the gods. But that was when most of the religious beliefs of the pharaohs or the Egyptian people started, was during this period in the late Old Kingdom. That's why I kind of stayed the Old Kingdom, because you kind of get architecture starts to explode, religion starts to explode, conquests start to explode. It's just the golden age, man. So then we get Neferefre Isi. Neferefre Isi, greatest conquester of the Old Kingdom, almost certainly. Conquered a lot of land for Egypt, building the empire. The empire was bigger than it had ever been up to this point, and that it will ever be probably for the next 500, 600, 700 years after this. So you can thank Neferefre Isi for that. You gotta go with 2 names there. And then there is Nusere Ini, 2445 to 2422 BCE. So this is, again, we barely have any like pictures of them. There's just a couple statues that still exist. So this is him and his consort there, his wife most likely. And then there is Menkahhor Kayu, 2422 to 2414 BCE. Now it's just a hieroglyph, all we have of them. Like I said, a lot is unknown about most of these pharaohs. That's just how that is. Then there's Djedkare Isesi. I believe he was one of the last pharaohs of Dynasty 5. Dynasty 5 was not as grand as the first 2, but Dynasty 5 is still a golden age for mainly, like I said, campaigns and conquests. So 2414 to 2375 BC. And then there's Unas. Unas was on the throne for 30 years, 2375 to 2345. Now this one you're kind of crazy, because it's like, man, I can't believe we actually have women having power this early on. The pharaohs, a lot of times when they were young and they couldn't take the throne, the mother would serve, or the consort wife would serve for them until they needed to, or if they couldn't rule for whatever reason. So women actually had a big influence in ancient Egypt, especially if you were of nobility, of course. The slaves did not, which ancient Egypt had a huge slave population, as known by that. And obviously, this old part especially was kind of fascinating. So you get both of them. Now I'm not sure if she actually ruled or not, but there will be more female pharaohs later down the line. The last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra, was a woman. So that's kind of interesting. But this is Unas himself there. So that is it for Dynasty 5. Now the last dynasty of the Old Kingdom is Dynasty 6. Dynasty 6 is where the Old Kingdom kind of collapses. That's just what they did. So, Dynasty 6 kicks off with Teti. TT, I don't know how you say that. 2345 to 2333 BC. Now, there is one pharaoh of Dynasty 6 that I really want to talk about here. There's Userkare. He's only pharaoh for like a year. Not much is known about him besides this hieroglyph. We just know he existed. A lot of short-reign pharaohs. Pepi the First was pharaoh for quite a while. He was 2332 to 2283 BCE. But after Pepi the First, we get Nemtiemsaf the First, also known as Merenra. So that's pretty cool. And then there's Pepi the Second. Pepi the Second is what I want to talk about here, because Pepi the Second. So he was kind of the bridge between the Pepis. Pepi the First was pretty revolutionary at the time. One of the greater pharaohs of Dynasty 6. Then Nemtiemsaf, expanding the religious practices in the conquests. Also building more pyramids, too. They built a lot of the pyramids. This is kind of when the later pyramids were built. Weaponry also starts to evolve toward this time. They transfer from stone to bronze to use for their weapons and most of their buildings as well, because most of the stone buildings... the earliest stone buildings in the world are Egyptian pyramids. I mean, this, you got to realize how long ago this was, guys. This is insane. So, Pepi the Second, now this is probably not true just because of the way people lived back then, and really we don't know much about this time period too heavily much. But Pepi the Second is generally considered to be, was he the last one? He was the last major pharaoh of Dynasty 6. Yeah. So, last major pharaoh of Dynasty 6. As you can see here, he took the throne in 2278 BC, and he died in 2183. That is a 95-year reign. Now, he might have been really young when he became pharaoh. Who knows? But if this were to be true, Pepi II is the longest reigning monarch in human history. No other monarch for the rest of time, for the next 4,000 plus years of the world's existence, has anybody reigned longer than Pepi II. Now, I'm just saying, it's probably not true. He probably didn't actually reign for 95 years. But whatever. It's not clear that he actually reigned 95 years or not. But what is clear is he was definitely pharaoh for a long time. Probably at least 50 years. Probably sometime between 50 and 95 years. Could have been 60, could have been 70. Who knows? Which would have been very impressive. But he kind of led to... Now, he was not a bad pharaoh by any means. But he kind of led to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Because his reign was so long, he was able to get a lot done, but all of his successors that were planned died before he did, because Egyptians didn't live long. So 95 years old as an Egyptian is pretty crazy, but he was over the age of 100 when he died. So all of his chosen successors died. Therefore, by the time he actually died, Nemtiemsaf II was able to inherit the throne, but he died within a year because he was so old. And he wasn't really able to build a sustainable empire amongst him because he was pharaoh for so long. And stuff just started to collapse during his reign. And that eventually led to the end of the Old Kingdom. So that is everything within the Old Kingdom, the first 4 dynasties of the Old Kingdom, or the 4 dynasties of the Old Kingdom, dynasties 3, 4, 5, and 6. And really the last great pyramids were built during Pepi II's reign. Now, I'm not saying they stopped building pyramids altogether, but their push was really not there. He was really trying to kind of build off what Djoser had started, and that's what all these pharaohs were doing during the Old Kingdom, was to really build off of what Djoser had laid out and wanted to do. Alright guys, I'm back. I am out here in this random swamp, also known as my backyard, for anyone who wants to know why I'm outside. With raining. It just stopped pouring down the rain. I actually filmed this whole thing and failed, so we're going to get back into this because the rain started and screwed up my entire mic situation. It was a nightmare. Speaking of nightmares, we're on to the first intermediate period, which was quite a nightmare for Egypt. Now, for those that don't know, Egypt was the Egyptian timeline between the Golden Ages was divided with intermediate periods. Now, this was the first intermediate period, or the first dark age in Egyptian history. Now, every single pharaoh that you're going to see in this video from the first intermediate period only ruled a fraction of Lower Egypt. They never ruled a part of Upper Egypt, and they never ruled over the entirety of Egypt until the Middle Kingdom happened. Actually, not even until the pharaoh Mentuhotep II, which was in Dynasty 11. So, Dynasty 7 was chaos. Essentially, Egyptologists have quoted this period of the 7th dynasty to be known as 70 rulers in 70 days. Okay? 70 rulers in 70 days. Which basically goes to show this time period was tumultuous. 70 days with 70 rulers. That just goes to show the entirety of the 7th dynasty. Now, we don't even know any of the pharaohs. Egypt was just in an entirety of a civil war at this time period. They stopped building pyramids, and no real big structures were built. No artifacts still exist from the first intermediate period. It was just a nightmare. 2182 BCE. So that brings us already to Dynasty 8. Now, Dynasty 8 is also from the first intermediate period. Now, we do know a couple pharaohs from Dynasty 8, but like I said, they only ruled over Lower Egypt. We have Nefertari, who ruled from 2182 to 2179 BCE. And then various kings and pharaohs. So just, we don't even know. I mean, we know about them, but they just ruled for such a short amount of time, or we barely know anything about them for me to put them on here. This was about the 30-year period, 29-year period from 2179 to 2150 BCE. Which brings us to Dynasty 9. So Dynasty 7 to 10 are ridiculously really just unknown entirely by Egyptologists. We don't really know much about them just because of it was a dark age. So Dynasty 9 starts with Merebra Kheti I, 2150 to 2149. That's the hieroglyph. I have put the hieroglyph down here above the name. Now, it's kind of disputed on whether or not this pharaoh's name was Merebra or Merebra Kheti I. We don't really know, but that's that. There was Merikara, Cleopatra, part of Dynasty 9. Now, there's a couple others, but this just goes all the way to 2139 BCE. Dynasty 10 is a little bit interesting. Now, Dynasty 10 was ruling at the same time as Dynasty 11. It was a rival to Dynasty 11. But Dynasty 10 was the last of the first intermediate period, the main kings ruling in Lower Egypt. These include Nebkara Kheti IV from 2139 to 2134 BCE, and then just a bunch of various kings between 2139 and 2117 BCE. So now we get to Dynasty 11, and this is what I like to call the Middle Kingdom. Now, this is the second golden age of Egypt. I have just become the pharaoh. I am now the new pharaoh. Pharaoh Mario Plush Bros. Pharaoh Plush Bros himself. Right here. Now, you see, ladies and gentlemen, this starts with Dynasty 11, with the Middle Kingdom. Now, the first pharaoh from Dynasty 11 is Mentuhotep I. On this presentation here, Mentuhotep I was the first pharaoh of the 11th dynasty. Now, the first few pharaohs of the 11th dynasty, Dynasty 11, were not pharaohs or even kings. They're normally referred to as nomarchs because they did not rule all of Egypt yet. Dynasty 11 started out as a rival dynasty to Dynasty 10. Now, if you remember the period of the various kings, 2139 to 2117, they were ruling over Lower Egypt. Well, Dynasty 11 emerged in Upper Egypt, and Mentuhotep I made it a goal through his descendants that they were going to conquer all of Egypt. And eventually in 2117, they are able to take over all. Mentuhotep I is able to take over that part, and then they keep trying to take over that. It doesn't get taken over, though, until a few pharaohs down the line. So you get Intef the First of 2117, and these are all ruling at the same time as Dynasty 10. But this is when it overlaps. So Intef the First, we get Intef the First, then Intef the Second from 2117 to 2117 to 2068 BCE. Now, these guys were nomarchs. They were not pharaohs. They were nomarchs. Same thing with Intef the Third, and then it wasn't until Intef the Third's son, Mentuhotep II, where stuff gets to get pretty crazy here. So Mentuhotep II is the first pharaoh since Pepi II to rule over the entirety of Egypt. Now, he rules from 2060 to 2009 BCE. Now, Mentuhotep II unites all of Egypt, and he rules it. The most powerful pharaoh in the last probably 400 or 500 years. Mentuhotep II was. He brought back pyramid building and for the pharaohs, the tombs. Although most the Middle Kingdom tried to bring back the Old Kingdom tradition of building pyramids, however, they were definitely not as prosperous as the Old Kingdom. They weren't as large, and most of the Middle Kingdom pyramids do not exist anymore. However, Mentuhotep II did issue that. And then we get Mentuhotep III, and then followed by Mentuhotep IV. Mentuhotep IV, as you can see here. Mentuhotep III. I can't talk. Mentuhotep III ruled from 2009 to 1997 BCE, and then Mentuhotep IV from 1997 to 1991 BCE. So that is it for Dynasty 11. Now, the one thing that the Dynasty 11 did put in place with Mentuhotep II, III, and IV, they were the first ones to create standing army. The first ever standing army that the Egyptian military had ever seen up to that point. And this will prove very beneficial with Dynasty 12. So Dynasty 12 was the most prosperous dynasty in the last big dynasty of the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom did not last as long as the Old Kingdom, but man, was it pretty prosperous. Now, Dynasty 12 starts with Amenemhat I. Amenemhat I rules from 1991 to 1971 BCE. Now, Amenemhat I and Dynasty 12 as a whole was the dynasty to create the Thiam Oasis. Now, what is the Thiam Oasis? For those of you not familiar with what the Thiam Oasis is, it is a canal that stretches from the Nile River all the way to Lake Moeris, which was a huge canal. Probably one of the biggest canals the world had ever seen up to that point. Amenemhat I was the guy to lay that out, although it did not get finished for generations. But the Thiam Oasis was constructed during Dynasty 12. They also had many conquests throughout the Middle East and sometimes even up into southern Europe, myth-wise. Amenemhat I was the founder, though, of Dynasty 12, and he laid all that out. In 1971 to 1962 BCE, Amenemhat I made the bold move to crown his son Senusret. There's a typo here. It's supposed to say Senusret I. Senusret the First to be a joint monarch alongside him. So that way, once he dies, Senusret can inherit. So Amenemhat I dies in 1962 BCE. Therefore, Senusret I becomes pharaoh on his own. And he rules from 1962 to 1926 BCE. Pretty good reign of like 36 years. Senusret I. He does look pretty snazzy over there, if I do say so myself. And the Middle Kingdom is when the famous snake thing in the chin wears that the pharaohs that we know today that I'm wearing right now kind of really started with the Middle Kingdom. After Senusret I, we get Amenemhat II, and then Senusret II. Senusret II was from 1895 to 1878 BCE, but it was Senusret II's son, Senusret III, who is probably one of the most successful pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. Senusret III, it is believed and it's kind of a legend that most Egyptologists don't believe. But it is theorized that Senusret II led many invasions throughout the lands, conquering them for Egypt back in the 1800s BCE during his 18-year reign. Some believe that he got all the way to Europe, to southern Europe, during his conquests, although most Egyptologists do not believe that. What is true and what we can confirm is that Senusret III did take his standing army all the way into the land of Canaan, which was the land that we now know as Israel, near Jerusalem. Now, Senusret III is revolutionary because he was able to take the Egyptians into Canaan, the land of Canaan, which is also where the story of Joseph takes place during the Bible about 300 years after this. The Egyptians were in the land of Canaan roughly 400 to 500 years before the arrival of the Israelites. So that goes to show how successful and how far the reaches were for the Middle Kingdom in its first Senusret III's leadership militarily that allowed for that to happen. So he dies in 1860 BCE, leaving the throne for Amenemhat III. Amenemhat III ruled from 1860 to 1815 BCE, a 45-year reign for Amenemhat III. Very, very impressive, if I do say so myself, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Amenemhat III, it was kind of conflicted on what to do after he died because he had no sons and heirs, but Dynasty 12 was so prosperous, probably one of the most exceptionally prosperous dynasties that Egypt had ever seen up to this point. Dynasty 12 was. So, Amenemhat III had no sons to inherit the throne. So, his successor is his sister wife. Not even kidding. I don't even know why I quotationed that. Sister wife, literally, his wife was his sister. Again, we've been through this. It was very common practice. Sobek Neferu. Now, Sobek Neferu only ruled for about 5 years, 1807, 1802 BCE. 4 years, 4.5. But Sobek Neferu was the first pharaoh ever, a female pharaoh ever, to rule in her own right, and one of the first women in the history of man to rule in her own right, Sobek Neferu. Although when she died, Dynasty 12 collapsed. However, Dynasty 13 emerged. Now, I mark this as the second intermediate period because that started after the death of the first pharaoh of Dynasty 13. But the first pharaoh of the 13th dynasty is considered to be the last pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom. Now, that is Sobek Hotep. Now, it's believed by some Egyptologists that Sobek Hotep could be the son of Amenemhat III, but there's no evidence to really prove that. But it's fun to believe. Therefore, Sobek Hotep would have been, if that was his daughter with his wife, would have been brother and sister offspring. But anyway, Sobek Hotep rules from 1802 to 1800 BCE. So not very long at all. So that is the end for the Middle Kingdom. So I'm going to take this off as we enter the next Dark Age. And then we enter the second Dark Age, which was pretty much the rest of Dynasty 13. The second intermediate period. Now this expands from Dynasty 14, 15, 16, and 17 during the second intermediate period. The second intermediate period was not as tumultuous as the first intermediate period, but man, was it not good. So we get a lot of pharaohs that we just don't know much about. So for a lot of these, I've just put a hieroglyph on the background, and then I just have the hieroglyph name above the name in English down here. So there's Sunbeth of the 13th dynasty, most likely the son of Sobek Hotep, but we don't know for sure. Like I said, Sobek Hotep was the last pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom. So now we get to the second intermediate period. He rules approximately until about 1796 BCE. And then we get Amenemhat V, Amini Kemal, Amini Quimau, Eufni, Amenemhat VI, Nebnuni, Seweketawi Sehotep Ibra. There's barely any artifacts from the second intermediate period that we know. And a lot of these pharaohs, actually no, all of these pharaohs had split reigns. The years are unknown, and they only ruled, again, just like the first intermediate period, only ruled in Lower Egypt. And Upper Egypt was just ruled by either nomarchs or just random priests or somebody else that was inferior to this group. So as of Dynasty 13, Sobek-Hotep did rule over all of Egypt, but following him, it was only Lower Egypt, and in that, not even all of Lower Egypt. So pretty bad. So then we get Nebnuni, Sobek-Hotep, then Nedjimibra, and then Sobek-Hotep II. As you can tell, these guys didn't rule very long. If you're just looking at the dates up here, that's all we really know about them. So 1777 BCE, Sobek-Hotep II. So then we get Hor the First. Hor the First again. We do have a picture, but again, just not much went down. Only ruled over that lower part. Only Lower Egypt, which was to the north. Kutawi Kaba, Jed Heperu. Now, as you can see, they weren't numbered, so no other pharaohs were named after them. Really, only the great pharaohs were able to get multiple of them. Most of these ones are not good. And then there's even worse. At the end of the 13th dynasty, we don't even really know what happened to the 13th dynasty, because we have unknown / debated period between 1770 to 1775, or 1770 to 1755 BCE. We don't really know what went on during that period. So then we get to Sobek-Hotep III, and then Nefer-Hotep I, Sobek-Hotep IV, Sobek-Hotep V, and then another debated period between 1725 and 1675 BCE. So then that's going to take us to Dynasty 14, which continues on with the second intermediate period. But we don't know anything really at all about Dynasty 14. We do know it was not as bad as Dynasty 7, but everything's just unknown because they just ruled such a little amount of land, and most of the pharaohs, there was probably a lot of them that ruled for such a short amount of time, we just have no clue. We know about a couple of them, but the order and piecing them together is just so mysterious. And that's the fascinating part about ancient Egypt. It's very mysterious. So this period lasted from 1675 to 1663 BCE, so it only lasted like 12 years under the second intermediate period. So then we get to Dynasty 15 with Salitis, Simkin, Kion, and Dynasty 17 starts. Now, Dynasty 17, just like the previous ones, ruled in only one of the states, Lower Egypt. However, it was split. The last pharaoh of Dynasty 16, or actually there was, we don't have Dynasty 6. Oh, I see how it is. So, Dynasty 16 was actually the last pharaoh of Dynasty 15, but he ruled at the same time as the pharaohs of Dynasty 17. So Dynasty 16 was kind of a blur. We don't know really anything about it. Again, that's why these intermediate periods are known as Dark Ages for Egypt, because we just don't know really anything about him. So Kion, this is his Sphinx here, or Kion. Kion, I don't know how you say that name. But he ruled from 1640 all the way to 1590 BCE. Now, this is about the time that the story of Joseph from the Bible, Hebrew Bible, takes place, when they still ruled over the land of Cain, or land of Canaan. The land of Canaan during this time. So that's just how it is. Second intermediate period, there we go. So this is Dynasty 17. Now, we don't know really anything about it. I just have a list of them all here. I've just made myself very small so you can see this. So this is a list of all of the Dynasty 16 and 17 pharaohs. As you can see right here, let me get out my laser pointer. You can't really see. Not all are mentioned. So we got Jehudi Sobek-Hotep VIII, Nefer-Hotep III, Mentu-Hotepi, Nebiral I, Nebiral II, Semenenra, Baby very unclear on Dedumos the first, Dedumos the second, Mentwimsof, Mentuhotep the sixth, Senusret the sixth, Pepi the third, Neb Matra, Enet Jerira, Maribra, Nu Ben Kra, and Nikara, who all ruled during Dynasty 17. Now, as you can see, This guy really ruled during probably the reign of all of these Dynasty 17 pharaohs, Kion. So that's how that goes. So now you can't really see this because I'm probably covering up, but there's Sobekimsaf the first over here, 1620 to 1606 BCE. He was one of the last. He was like one of the pharaohs to actually kind of get Egypt back rolling again. Conquered a lot of Upper Egypt for Dynasty 17 and made way for the next golden age, which was to happen in the next couple decades. So then we get Sobekimsaf II, who continues the conquests, ruling for 33 years, 1606 to 1573 BCE. And then there's Intef V. Intef V looks freaking awesome. It's a shame that he wasn't able to rule all the time. Now, you're wondering, like, how did they get to see him in gold? That is actually not gold. That is probably most likely just very shiny stone that they used. The original mummy of Intef V was probably made out of gold, but a lot of them were stolen by grave robbers during antiquity. So that's how that went. There's also Intef VI and Intef VII, who all ruled from Dynasty 17. Now this guy literally looks like a rattlesnake. I'm not gonna lie to you. So then we get Kintinra or Sekenera Tao, who all ruled down that time. Now Tao was one of the better known pharaohs from the Second Dark Age. So Sekenenre supposedly had a pool of hippopotamuses, and there was an old tale called the Quarrel of Apophis and Sekenenra. Now Apophis was a ruler in a different kingdom who supposedly wrote a letter to Sekenenra about that, the hippopotamus. And he was the last major ruler of the Hyksos dynasty, was Apophis. That was in Thebes, was the pool of hippopotamuses. And this was, and then he told Sekenenre that he could hear his hippopotamuses all the way down where he lived in Upper Egypt. So this signifies the story was probably made up or stretched, but it signifies the growing conflict between Lower and Upper Egypt that they had been facing for centuries. Now, Kamos is after succeeded Tao, and he was the last pharaoh of Dynasty 17 in the Second Intermediate Period. So now we get to the Golden Age of Egypt, the New Kingdom, with Dynasty 18. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have the Egyptian gear back on because now we are entering the New Kingdom. Arguably the most well-known period of ancient Egypt. Usually when people refer to ancient Egypt, they refer to the New Kingdom. This includes dynasties 18, 19, and 20. The three dynasties of the Golden Age. Now this is the Golden Ages get. This is when ancient Egypt reaches its peak, ladies and gentlemen. So, it reaches its peak of power during the New Kingdom. Some of the most famous pharaohs ruled during this time. Most of the pharaohs that you've probably heard of reigned during this time. So, without further ado, let's get into this. Now, the first pharaoh of the New Kingdom was pretty revolutionary, obviously, because he was the new dynasty. Dynasty 18 with Ahmose the First. Now, Ahmose the First created many reforms, as did most New Kingdom Egyptian pharaohs did. Expanding the military, expanding the civilization, expanding the empire. Ahmose the First is considered to be the first pharaoh of the Egyptian Empire, because the Egyptian Empire, which you'll hear about sometimes people referring that to, didn't really start until the New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom was when it really existed. And Ahmose the First expanded the architecture, the ways of life. Most of the recorded history of Egypt that we know today comes from the New Kingdom. Everything else is pretty much just kind of a mystery. But the New Kingdom we actually know a lot about. Ahmose the First was the founder. 1549 to 1525 BCE. Then we get Amenhotep the First, for 5 years, followed by Thutmose I. Now, Thutmose I really was pretty important pharaoh to Egyptian history. Thutmose I, like I said Ahmose I expanded the military, but no, if you want to talk about military expansioning, Thutmose I is your guy. Thutmose I let the gateway for his successors to really take on and expand the land. Thutmose I expanded the Egyptian empire all the way up the Euphrates River and continued for years upon years, almost a 30-year reign he had there, from Thebes all the way up the Euphrates River there. He really kicked off the Golden Age. And then we get Thutmose II, his son, who really didn't do a whole lot. And then there was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh, one of the most famous female figures in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut, right there, Dynasty 18. Now Hatshepsut, she was the 5th pharaoh of Dynasty 18. She was Thutmose II's wife, but Thutmose II's son, Thutmose III, was not old enough to rule yet, so Hatshepsut had to become pharaoh before him. She was also the daughter of Thutmose I, so they were brother and sister. But that's how you kept the wealth in the family back then. She took all of the traditionally male roles, just like all the... She was more of a regent than ruling in her own right, Hatshepsut, but she's very famous for having a lot of masculine traits that she had to... I mean, that's what you had to do as a female pharaoh. She had to inherit all the masculine traits, traditionally male garb she had to wear. So this is like the pharaoh's outfit, but she had to wear it because there was no one else to take it. One of the most prolific builders in ancient Egypt, oversaw large-scale construction projects like the Karnak Temple Complex, the Red Chapel, Speos, Artemidos, and most famously, the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut were built during her reign. So very revolutionary, and then she was followed by Thutmose III. Thutmose III is an absolute legend. Now, Thutmose III is overshadowed by Ramses the Great of Dynasty 19, but Thutmose III would probably be one of the most famous pharaohs, probably the most famous pharaoh, had Ramses not existed. Ramses existed, and Thutmose III is overshadowed by him. But he's known as Thutmose the Great, and he ruled for quite a while. Obviously, his father died when he was 2 years old, so his mother was Hatshepsut. His mother/aunt, I guess. His legacy is a warrior king. He became the sole ruling pharaoh of the kingdom after Hatshepsut died. He conducted over 17 campaigns during his reign, all victorious. He had no failed campaign of the 17 that he did, and he is considered the father of the ancient Egyptian navy, creating the first combat navy in the ancient world. The first ever combat navy was invented under Thutmose III, and he is regarded as one of the most powerful, celebrated rulers of the New Kingdom. Actually, he was such a great warrior, never lost any of his campaigns, that he is known as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, which I was watching a video about Useful Charts who brought this up. For those of you guys that don't know, Useful Charts, great YouTube channel, does family tree stuff for royal family trees. Thutmose III is known as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, which is kind of funny because shouldn't Napoleon be known as the Thutmose III of Europe? Just thought that was kind of weird that somebody who lived 1400 BC is considered being somebody who lived in the 1800s AD as opposed to the other way around. That was just kind of weird. But yeah, Thutmose III, pretty freaking epic. Probably the greatest military strategist in ancient history. Without a doubt, of this time period, the greatest military strategist, Thutmose III. Then we get Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II rules for 25 years. Then he's followed by Thutmose IV for about 10 years, and then Amenhotep III. So Amenhotep III, pretty freaking epic. And then Amenhotep III was the father of Akhenaten. Now, Akhenaten actually ended up changing his name in the second half of his reign. He started out as Amenhotep IV because his father was Amenhotep III. He started out as Amenhotep IV. But Akhenaten is very famous. He changed his name to Akhenaten because Akhenaten, was the pharaoh who was probably the first person in human history to suggest monotheism, which monotheism is the worship of only one god. Previously, thousands of years going back, all the ancient Egyptians followed a system of polytheism, which is worship of many gods. However, Akhenaten suggested that there only be one deity. And this made him very unpopular as Amenhotep IV. So he changed his name to Akhenaten. Now, Akhenaten also married Nefertiti, who is this woman here, or Neferuaten, as she's known as, but Nefertiti now is what we mainly know her as, but her name was originally Neferuaten. So he married her, probably one of the only New Kingdom pharaohs who did not marry his sister. But yeah, he was very unpopular by the people and kind of led to the fall of the 18th dynasty. But Akhenaten was succeeded by Semenkhara first, and then his wife Neferuaten, or Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti. Now, Nefertiti died in 1332. Akhenaten actually had one. Him and Nefertiti never had any kids, but Nefertiti, once she died, Akhenaten had actually previously had a son with his sister, not his consort, but his sister, who eventually became pharaoh, and that was Tutankhamun, also known as King Tut. Most people probably know King Tut. Now, Tutankhamun, or King Tut. King Tut was not actually a very influential pharaoh at all, but the only reason that he's so famous is because back in the 1920s, when they did the archaeological expeditions in ancient Egypt to look for mummified artifacts, they found a gate that had never been opened for 3,000 years, and inside was the mummy of Tutankhamun. It was made out of pure gold. All the artifacts were all still there, hadn't been touched in thousands of years, he is the only mummified, and we found remains of mummified pharaohs before, but King Tut's was the only one that was completely intact, had not been touched since he was buried. And most of the gold and stuff from the other pharaohs, the gold and other items, had been stolen during the Roman antiquity period. But King Tut's was not even touched at all, which made worldwide headlines. And that's the reason why his picture here looks so prominent, because that is Tutankhamun. Now, Tutankhamun was only about 9 or 10 years old when he became pharaoh, and he didn't really do much of anything. Actually, they found, since his is the only mummified pharaoh mummy that they've actually found completely intact, he was very unhealthy, and that was likely because of the inbreeding that had been happening. His parents were brother and sister. What do you expect? But that's how that was. And then he died when he was about 19 years old. They buried him, and it was never touched again. But they found it completely intact, which is the fascinating part about King Tut. Other than that, he didn't really do much of anything as pharaoh that we know about. We just know that his is the only one that we've completely found, obviously from the New Kingdom, Dynasty 18. After King Tut died, the throne went to a pharaoh named I, he was somehow related to one of the previous pharaohs, I think Thutmose II, somehow. But he only reigned for 3 years. And then it went to Horemheb. Horemheb tried to do his best to... Horemheb was not related at all to
King Tut or Akhenaten at all. But he tried to do his best to erase Akhenaten from history because of the monotheism, the worship of only one god that Akhenaten had proposed and that some Egyptians had started to follow, which was very, very unpopular. And Horemheb wanted to erase Akhenaten from history so no one would remember him. But obviously, 3 or 4,000 years later, we're at now, and most people know of Akhenaten more than Horemheb. And again, he wasn't even pharaoh that long. 18 years. It was whatever. But yeah. And Horemheb was not very liked either by the people. And he eventually was the fall of the 18th dynasty. So then we enter Dynasty 19, which is the next dynasty to rule, obviously, from the New Kingdom. Now, this is when the New Kingdom reached its peak, because obviously with Akhenaten and King Tut, Tutankhamun, and Horemheb, the later pharaohs of Dynasty 18 sort of put it down. But then we get to Dynasty 19. The first pharaoh of Dynasty 19 was a completely new guy named Ramses. Now, this is not the most famous Ramses of them all. This is Ramses the First. Obviously, like I said, Dynasty 18 had been thriving toward the beginning with Thutmose III, the warrior kings. But Ramses the First only ruled for about 2 years. He wasn't very famous at all, but he did start Dynasty 19, which Dynasty 19 was probably the most prosperous, most exceptionally prosperous dynasty of all 31 of them. Now, 18 was pretty prosperous too, but 19 was really just exceptionally prosperous. After Ramses the First, we get Seti the First. Now, Seti the First, he was the father of the most famous pharaoh probably to ever live, besides King Tut. Most people know King Tut more than Ramses the Second, but Seti the First was pretty cool. He was pretty revolutionary himself. He was the son of Ramses the First. His name means Set, which indicates that he was consecrated to the god Set. There was an Egyptian god named Set. He was consecrated to the god as Seti the First. As with most pharaohs, Seti had several names. Now, after the enormous social upheavals generated by Akhenaten's religious reform, Horemheb, Ramses I, and Seti I's main priority was to reestablish the order of the kingdom and to reaffirm Egypt's sovereignty. Now, that's part of the reason Dynasty 18 fell. And the early pharaohs of Dynasty 19, Ramses I and Seti I, tried to bring Egypt's peace back from the chaos that Akhenaten had started. Increasing external pressures with the Hittites, Seti, with the energy and determination that he had, confronted the Hittites several times in battle, of course, without succeeding in destroying the Hittites as a potential danger to Egypt, because they could have led an expedition in there. And he reconquered most of the disputed territories that Egypt had generally concluded with its military campaigns way back with Thutmose III. Those have been disputed under the late pharaohs of Dynasty 18, like Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, and Horemheb, which really didn't do a good job at establishing those. And most of Seti I's military successes were recorded in some large scenes placed on the front of the temple Amun, situated in Karnak. So the Amun temple is where we know most about Seti I. But the capital obviously was at Memphis at this time. It was moved back to Memphis on the bank of the Nile. But his son was Ramses the Great, also known as Ramses II, was probably the most prosperous pharaoh in Egyptian history. Now, as you can tell right now, he had a very long reign. 66 plus years, in fact. Now, it is this Ramses the Great, there's no doubt that he lived a very long time. Likely lived over the age of 90 years back in the 1200s BCE. As you can see, 1279 to 1213. Now, Ramses the Great was not a very humble guy. In fact, he built many statues of himself. This one is displayed, I think, in the British Museum, some museum in Britain. But he built many statues of himself, including, there's one outside of a temple. There's 3 statues of him, large statues of him, sitting down. And that's the main reason we have almost so many statues of Ramses II. As far as military tacticians go, he was probably greater and conquered more than Thutmose III did. He's known as Ramses the Great, obviously. The most celebrated pharaoh of the New Kingdom, most celebrated pharaoh probably in Egyptian history. He mainly focused, he had major focuses during his reign because his reign was so long. He started out trying to rebuild Egypt, obviously, just like his father and his grandfather had. He built many cities, many temples and monuments, mostly of himself. Built many statues of himself. And he led military campaigns all the way in Syria and several military expeditions into the Levant, where he reasserted Egyptian control over Canaan and Phoenicia. So he reassured Canaan, Phoenicia, and he also led a number of expeditions into Nubia, all commemorated in inscriptions at the Beit El Wali and Gurf Hussein temples. He celebrated an unprecedented 13 or 14 Sed festivals for more than any other pharaoh. Sed was a god, I believe. Estimates the age of his death, 90 or 91 years, and he's considered the most likely figure. That was considered most likely how long he lived. So he lived much longer than his reign. His body was later moved to the royal cache, where it was discovered by archaeologists in 1881. Ramses' mummy is now on display at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, located at the city of Cairo. So you can go to Cairo and see Ramses' mummy. He expanded the bounds of the empire by an insane amount. Just exponentially grew. There was the Battle of Kadesh, which dominates scholarly view of Ramses II military prowess and power. He nevertheless enjoyed more than a few outright victories over Egypt's enemies during his reign. He hated his enemies, that's for gosh dang sure. The Egyptian army had an estimated totaled 100,000 men and a formidable force to strengthen Egyptian influence. He built the army, increased it up to 100,000 men. 100,000 soldier army at this time was absolutely insane. The biggest army the world had ever seen, probably up to that point. Ramses II also decisively defeated the Sheridan Sea pirates, who were wreaking havoc along Egypt's Mediterranean coast. So he also expanded the navy that Thutmose had started. He had 100,000 in his army alone, countless multi-thousand in the navy protecting his Mediterranean borders. He was also hated by his enemies, but they couldn't get in, and he was great at both attacking and defending Egypt. He expanded his reaches into Ionia, Anatolia, and perhaps even the island of Sardinia. Ramses posted troops and ships at strategic points along the coast and patiently allowed the pirates to attack their perceived prey before skillfully catching them by surprise in sea battle and capturing them all in a single action. Just amazing. He had at least 4 campaigns in Syria, just completely wrecking the place, across the Dog River, the Nile al-Kalb, and pushed into Amuru. And they got as far north as Dapur, where he had a statue of himself erected in Syria. So there's a statue in Syria of Ramses II. However, he died in 1213, and then the throne passed to Mereneptah. Mereneptah was not nearly as fond as Ramses II, actually led to sort of the fall of Egypt down here. I mean, the problem with long reigning pharaohs was they were powerful, but they weren't able to sustain it after they died. Ramses the Great was a very powerful pharaoh, but his successors had a hard time living up to his successes, and they were very unsuccessful. Mereneptah, Seti II, Amenemhotep, Siptah, like, these guys didn't do much of anything, and they barely ruled very long. Tawsret was the last pharaoh of Dynasty 19. So now we're moving into Dynasty 20. Now, Dynasty 20 was the last dynasty of the New Kingdom, and you are going to be surprised to see about how creative the names were of these pharaohs. Now, this is where Ramses, the legend of Ramses the Great, takes into charge here. So the first pharaoh of Dynasty 20 was Seknakte for 4 years, the founder of Dynasty 20. And then we get Ramses the Third. They named them after Ramses the Great, obviously. None of these Dynasty 20 pharaohs were nearly as successful as Ramses II, and all of the territory that had been conquered by Ramses II all slowly fizzled out as these pharaohs ruled. So you get Ramses II, Ramses III, Ramses IV, Ramses V, Ramses VI, Ramses VII, Ramses VIII, and a lot of these pharaohs were from different branches of the family, and they often fought over power, losing more and more power, losing more and more territory, losing more and more men. So you would have like a father-son succession, and then the uncle, cousin, and then it would just go all over the place. The tree was just like this on the successions. It was really unstable, but they were all Ramses. Ramses V, Ramses VI, Ramses VII, the 8th, the 9th, 10th, and Ramses the 11th was the very last pharaoh of Dynasty 20 and the last pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Because with that unstableness of the last 11 pharaohs in Dynasty 20 led to the collapse of the Egyptian Golden Age. And in about the year 1000 BC, there was an event known as the Bronze Age collapse that occurred, which was, for some reason, many empires in Southern Europe and the Middle East areas completely just fell apart entirely for whatever reason. And that all happened at the exact same time. And it was known as the Bronze Age collapse, which was a horrible time for history. And that was during the reign of Ramses the 11th. So once Ramses the 11th died, we get to the Third Intermediate Period. And Egypt enters another dark age, and it will slowly fall till its collapse by the Roman Empire, and it will be taken over by the Persians later on too. But that is the New Kingdom. So now we're going to move on to the Third Intermediate Period.
All right, so Third Intermediate Period starts off with Dynasty 21. Most people won't even know there's this many dynasties in Egypt. This is the 21st dynasty. We start off with the pharaoh known as Smendes I. Now, again, this picture here is not real gold. However, most of the late period Egypt, this isn't necessarily the late period yet. They call that a different time. This is the Third Intermediate. So this is between the New Kingdom and the late period. Although the late period was definitely anything but a golden age. So Smendes I was pharaoh from 1077 to 1051 BCE, so not too shabby. Does look pretty cool. A lot of the pharaohs from this point, the Third Intermediate Period, through the end, we actually have pretty good records of because they were later on. It's just the other stuff. Although the Third Intermediate Period was just right post Bronze Age collapse, so the entire Middle East was struggling at this time. Then we get Amenemhotep I, 1051 to 1047. And then we get Sesenus I. Sesenus I actually ruled for quite a long time. He was in there from 1047 to 1001 BCE, so 1047 to 1001. Quite a long time. He does look pretty snazzy, if I do say so myself. I like how they got the cobra sticking out way. I've always loved that about the Egyptian pharaohs. I wonder why that is. Why they had that on there. It's just kind of unknown fact, but there we go. Then we get Amenemhotep, who was from 1001 to 992 BCE. Then we get Asochor the Elder, Siamun, Sesenus II, and that's it for Dynasty 21. So then we get to Dynasty 22. Again, also part of the Third Intermediate Period. So, Dynasty 22, 23, and 24 were various pharaohs that ruled between 837 and 720 BCE. So, this was not supposed to go here yet. This is still kind of like a heads up. This is Dynasty 22 right now. So, Dynasty 22 starts off with one of the most famous pharaohs for Christians or anybody that worships the Bible. Shawshank I was pharaoh from 943 to 922. Now, Shawshank I actually is mentioned by name in the Bible, and he's the oldest pharaoh that's actually officially been recorded that is actually did exist. Now, previously in the Bible, there is a pharaoh just called the Pharaoh, which appears much earlier. And Egyptologists and scholars over the years have tried to decipher who that is, which pharaoh that actually is. Some say it's Ramses II. Some people think it's Thutmose III. I personally probably think it was probably Ramses the Great, but it could have been Thutmose III. It was one of those two, I think. Some believe other ones. But at one point in the Bible, I don't know the exact section, but it mentions a pharaoh named Shishak, the Egyptian king Shishak. Now, it's pretty much determined by this point, because there was no pharaoh that we know of actually named Shishak, but Shawshank is pretty dang close. And this, the 900s BCE lines up with perfectly with the time of that period of that Bible chapter to take place. So Shishak is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, like I said. So, in all the iterations. So Shawshank I, and this goes to show that there are many parts in the Bible that are actually historical. Actually true stories. Because as you can see here, Shishak or Shawshank I actually existed. And he was actually a pharaoh. That is a literal sphinx of Shawshank I. So, there you go. He was followed by Osorkon I, who was in there from 922 to 887 BCE. And then there is Shawshank II, 887 to 880. Takelot I, Osorkon II. Osorkon II is pretty sick. I think Osorkon II also appears in the Bible as well. Kind of as with a different name. Obviously, he's not called Osorkon II. That's what the Egyptians called him. But kind of like Shawshank, everybody else in the Middle East knew him as Shishak and not Shawshank. So that's how you get that. Then there's Shawshank III, Shawshank IV. And there's also, supposedly it was a Shawshank V, but we don't really know much about him at all. And then there was Pa. Pretty cool. And then Shabaka, Shebitku, Taharka, and I don't know. I might be getting ahead of myself here. So Dynasty 23 and 24 were opposing dynasties. So Dynasties 23 and 24 both reigned during the Dynasty 22 as kind of rival dynasties who ruled over small portions of Egypt during the Third Intermediate Period. So, I didn't include any of them because they're various pharaohs. None of them really reigned very long. But Dynasty 23 and 24 lasted between 837 and 720 BCE. So just keep that in mind that they were ruling during Dynasty 22. So now we get to... I'm going way far, but I'm going the wrong way. After Shawshank V, we get Pa. Pa was part of Dynasty 23 and 24. I believe. So these are all Dynasty, because they're not Dynasty 25. I think they're Dynasty 23, 24, but it's kind of disputed on what dynasty they're really from. So there's Pa from 720 to 714, Shabaka, Shebitku, and Taharka. Taharka looks pretty epic. Then there's Ashurbanipal. So it's coming up around the time where Egypt was conquered by the Persians And they were conquered by the Persians a couple of times. So I believe... Let me fact check myself to make sure I know when it was conquered the first time. When did Persia conquer Egypt? So it was in 525. So we get Ashurbanipal. This was Dynasty 25. Pa, Shabaka, Shibitku, Taharka, and then the warrior pharaoh Ashurbanipal. So now we get to Dynasty 26. So Dynasty 26 was the start of the late period, which was basically the downfall of the Egyptian Empire. So it wasn't until 525 when Persia conquered Egypt. But Dynasty 26 is really considered to be like the last organic pharaohs to actually be pharaoh. So we start with Psamtik I. So I put the background here as kind of like a war going on, because through this time, this is when Persia starts to come in and try to take over Egypt with Darius I and stuff like that. But Psamtik I was pharaoh for quite a long time, 653 to 610 BCE. And then we get Necho I, followed by Psamtik II, and then Wahibre, and then Ahmose II. Ahmose II was the last actual pharaoh to actually have a reign who was Egyptian. The last real Egyptian pharaoh. So he's from 570 to 526 BCE. So you get Ahmose II. He dies, leaving the throne to his son, Psamtik III. Now, Psamtik III doesn't go down too well, because he is the one who gets taken over by the Persians. Now, Persia had been on many campaigns, taking over many empires up to this point. Babylonia had previously been conquered in 539, and now that brought an end to the Salite dynasty and the native control of Egypt. So Egypt now had new Persian overlords. So in 525, the Persians come in and take it over, which brings us into Dynasty 27 with Cambyses II. So he was Persian emperor at this time, and like I said, foreigners that ruled over Egypt, and not only just Egypt, they also took over Babylonia, Libya, and Nubia. Even the Nubians and Libyans, the Babylonians and the Egyptians had to bow down to Cambyses. The Persian Empire was absolutely huge, and it's not getting any smaller anytime soon. It's only going to increase when Alexander the Great comes into the field. So Cambyses II ends up ruling for only 3 years. But then we get Darius I. Darius I is kind of legendary because he really was the guy to make Egypt real part of the Persian Empire. And a lot of the Egyptians that were in old-fashioned Egypt didn't really... there weren't too many of them left by this point, because they'd either killed them all off, or the people didn't live long back then. But Darius I was in power for quite a long time, 522 to 486 BCE. So then you get Xerxes I, Artaxerxes I, Darius II, and that's it for Dynasty 27. So that just takes us to the 400s. So then we get to Dynasty 28. Now, Dynasty 28, there was only one pharaoh from Dynasty 28. Because briefly, for about 6 years, the Egyptians were able to take back the throne from the Persians. Although it was very brief. It lasted from 404 to 398 BCE. And Amyrtaeus is really considered to be the only pharaoh from Dynasty 28. There might have been more, but he's the only one that we actually really care about, because the one we really only know about. And he probably was the only pharaoh from Dynasty 28 because he was Egyptian. So, yeah, that's how he is. He's a Egyptian. All right. Dang it. All right. Moving on now to Dynasty 29. Now, Dynasty 29 is back with the sort of Egyptians. I mean, I don't really know what's going on at this time. Egypt is in such a mess right now. But we have Nepherites the first, Achoris, also known as Hakor. So these are also Egyptians that are ruling, Egyptian pharaohs. But again, Dynasty 28 and 29 were so short-lived. So then we get to Dynasty 30. Dynasty 30 was the last, second to last dynasty, and it starts off with Nectanebo the first, Jedhor Teos, Nectanebo the second, and that's it for Dynasty 30. Not much going on. They're just trying to keep Egypt in the hands of the pharaoh, but it just doesn't go out too well. And then we get to Dynasty 31, which was the last Egyptian dynasty that actually existed and they actually number. So, again, these are all Persians. Artaxerxes III comes in. Then we get Artaxerxes IV, Darius III, another Persian warrior. These guys are all Persian warriors this time. So they take him over. That's why the dynasty power shifts so much. So from Dynasty 30, at the end of Dynasty 30, Persians come back in, really take it over pretty much for good, but not for good because it's going to get taken over again by the Romans. So we get Dynasty 31, Artaxerxes III, Artaxerxes IV, Darius III, and that is it. Darius III was the last Egyptian pharaoh because in 332, the Persian Empire was taken over. So so I got this wrong. The previous group of Persians were the Achaemenid Persians. The big portion of the Persian Empire was taken over by this guy here. So the fall of Egypt happens. This is again the late period. So this is the Persian and Roman empires. So we get Alexander the Great, the legendary Alexander the Great takes over Egypt from Darius III. And this is not a dynasty. This is just the Persian kings. So Alexander the Great, he rules for a good 9 years. And for those of you that don't know, as far as ancient history goes, Alexander the Great conquered more territory than almost anybody else in human history. I mean, you pull up a map of Alexander the Great's territory, it is just absurd. The only person I can think of that actually had a bigger empire than Alexander the Great was the Mongols with Genghis Khan. But both of them, like each other, it had to split once he died. So the main portion of it was Philip III, Alexander IV, but after that, it kind of fell apart because he couldn't keep the power in the family. So Egypt, so his empire was split. So Egypt goes to one of his sons, or not his son, he goes to one of his military generals named Ptolemy. So this is Ptolemy the First. So he ends up taking over Egypt and most of Africa, while his other generals take other places of the Persian Empire. But Ptolemy gets what is Egypt. So this starts what is pretty much known as the fall of Egypt, which is the Ptolemaic period. And this goes from, it kind of becomes its own dynasty for a little bit, the Ptolemaic dynasty, but then the Romans come in with Mark Antony and Julius Caesar and completely just wipe out ancient Egypt as a whole. And then it goes to the Romans for the next several hundred years, and then the rest is history. So, Ptolemy the First rules from 309 to 281 BCE. And then we get some really creative name of pharaohs. We get Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third, Ptolemy the fourth, Ptolemy the fifth, Ptolemy the sixth, Ptolemy the second, you guessed it, Ptolemy the eighth, Ptolemy the ninth, Ptolemy the 10th, Ptolemy the 11th, Ptolemy the 12th. And then after Ptolemy the 12th, in 51 BCE, we get a female pharaoh, Cleopatra. So Cleopatra is the very last person that you could ever consider a pharaoh. Now, a lot of these other ones you probably didn't even consider them pharaohs. But Cleopatra is the last chance that they had. She rules from 51 to 30 BCE. And she was the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, although Julius Caesar had died like 15 years prior, so then Mark Antony comes in. Mark Antony's the guy, is the Roman that takes over the entirety of Egypt. And then Egypt switches hands over to the Romans after Cleopatra's death in 30 BC. So, that was a look at the entirety of ancient Egypt. Every single pharaoh in Egyptian history we just went over. We can go back through them all. We're back to the Middle Kingdom now. So with that, guys, stay tuned for later today because there's going to be a huge announcement on my community tab that I really want you guys to check out because it's going to be a huge, ambitious project that I'm planning out to having to do with Egyptian pharaohs because they are so fascinating. And we are not done with Egyptian pharaohs on this channel, ladies and gentlemen. So stay tuned for that announcement. And that is going to conclude today's video on every single Egyptian pharaoh's line of succession. And in this project that I'm talking about, we're going to get more into the details and the nitty-gritty of the pharaohs and of each dynasty in general. So, I thank you guys for watching. Be sure to comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye! Wham!